Tim, so lovely to talk to you today. We are talking, of course, the HSC Biology exam, which is coming up, and the work that students can be doing to get ready for that. Just to get us into the mindset of the exam, like when is it, what time of day, what can students expect, what should they be kind of thinking and feeling to get their head into that space?
Yeah, into the space. Well, yeah, it does vary year to year in terms of the timing of it. It depends upon the cohort of students across the state and the combination of subjects that they choose. But the exam itself is pretty standard. Students will be quite familiar with it. It's going to be a 3 hour exam, and they'll have that additional 5 minutes reading time to calm the nerves and just get a sense of what lays ahead over the next 3 hours. The paper itself, it's a 100 mark paper with two sections. And again, it's pretty standard format. You've got the 20 multiple choice questions, which they typically try and scaffold from easier questions through to more complex. And that's an intentional approach to try and get the kids calm the nerves and sort of get them into the run of the exam. And then obviously there's the part B, or section 2 as it's called, which will consist of shorter responses to, I guess, moderate length. We call them long responses, but they're at most typically an 8 mark question or a 7 mark question, and sometimes two of those. In 2025, the exam is in week 2 of the exam block, and it's on, from remembering, on Friday, 25th of October, and it's going to be in the morning session from 9:30 through to 12:30 with that 5 minute reading time at the start of that.
Do you think, Tim, the timing being morning versus afternoon has any impact from what you've seen on students? Is there anything in particular for a morning exam that students should be thinking about? I mean, breakfast, obviously, making sure you've fed the brain.
Yeah, it's exactly what you've just said. Personally, I like the idea of the morning exams. It's sort of hopefully you've had a good night rest, although that can be difficult with the stresses of the HSC exam. But I think sort of getting up early, having a breakfast and a healthy breakfast, and not having too long a wait time between sort of waking up and actually doing the exam. It just provides that opportunity to eat. I'll rest the night before, eat healthy, and then sort of without too much of stressing before the exam kicks off. So yeah, personally think it's a good thing. So fingers crossed for the cohort that they do as well.
Straight into it without thinking about
Yeah,
it too much.
exactly. Yeah.
What advice would you give for students in terms of thinking about structuring a study routine at this point? Like, what would just be a good kind of rhythm or approach to revision and study, do you think?
Yeah, look, I think it's important for students to remember that they'll be carrying typically 10, if not 12, sometimes more units of work, and each one of those units has equal value in a sense in terms of the contribution that they can make to their final HSC mark. So I certainly believe that a study timetable is really important, and in terms of how rigorous that is, that can vary student to student, but I think they're well advised to sort of allocate a reasonably equitable amount of time to each of their subjects or courses, knowing that that each 2 units of work contribute equally to their final mark. And in terms of different strategies, look, they do go by different names. There's two of the ones that I've long used, but they've gone, or recommended, but go by various names: chunking and space repetition. And it's certainly very applicable to biology as a course, and students sometimes do it naturally or intuitively. The concept of chunking is biology. We have some really big topics, for example, like protein synthesis, that can be broken down into chunks, and that might be transcription, translation, how that ties in with DNA replication, and each of those are reasonably complex in their own right. And it's the idea that students will try and master the concept of DNA replication and have a pretty solid foundation in that before they then go on and look at transcription, and same again before they move on to translation. And so if they really understand each of those chunks, it makes the connections between them, I think, easier to make if they really have that deeper understanding of each of those chunks, as I call them these days. And that's then linked in with the concept of space repetition, where, in short, you master one of those topics, and then you gradually increase the time between revisiting them. So you might do DNA replication, just throw a Monday out there, and you might revisit that the following day, Tuesday, and sort of tie it in with your study timetable, and just see how well you can sort of recall the knowledge and key concepts as you move your way through DNA replication. And then you might spread that out, do some study of other subjects or other concepts within biology, and then maybe 3 days later you come back and see how much of that knowledge related to DNA replication that you can recall, and just combine that, so chunking and spaced repetition, I certainly believe is quite valuable in building and retaining the knowledge that's needed in biology, but again, applicable to most of the other subjects as well. I guess lower level, but important to help on that. The flashcards, it's been done since I was a student myself, just to calm the nerves. Again, that can help in if they're morning exams or even afternoon exams, where students will start panicking that they've forgotten important concepts, just to calm the nerves and sort of make sure that they're doing the flashcards with the definitional key ideas on the back of the cards. And also, probably the biggest tip would be to practice previous exams, and really make sure that you focus on engaging with the marking criteria and just finding out where the holes in the knowledge base are, so that you can sort of, when you redo the exam or similar questions, that you can try and plug those holes.
And the overall message, I think, is like, start as soon as you can.
Yes,
And it's
definitely.
never too late, right? Like,
Yeah,
it's, if the student's watching this just a couple of weeks before exam, it's not too late to
yeah,
start that practice routine, start
yeah.
doing those practice exams.
Yeah, as we move through the session, we'll talk about some other key tips and more specific ones as they apply to the exam itself.
Yeah, let's touch briefly on topics. I mean, you've been teaching biology for a while now, you know the space so well. What are the topics that generally tend to trip students up, and what's your advice for mastering some of those trickier concepts?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I guess one of the key foundations I think that students and teachers, when we're teaching it, really need to address is making sure that we engage quite explicitly with the syllabus and the syllabus dot points, as we call them, and really make sure that every word has value within the syllabus. And the reason I say that is that it's the how, I guess, NESA equals the playing field between all students, no matter their background or who the teacher is in front of them. The HSC questions themselves are very precisely written to the language of the syllabus dot points. And certainly, in my experience, where students can trip themselves up is, I guess, miscommunicating their understanding of how certain concepts, or not teasing them apart enough. What do I mean by that? The key example I'd go to is students are required to have a reasonably deep understanding of cell division in the form of mitosis and meiosis. And often, as teachers, when we teach it, DNA replication is thrown into those conversations around cell replication. But what we don't do is tease them apart enough so that students actually do understand that DNA replication itself is not part of mitosis or meiosis. It actually precedes it. And so, yeah, often students don't spend enough time when it comes to the exam itself really teasing apart the language of the question and really understanding what it is that the question's asking. So,
Is it safe
yeah,
to stay on? Is it sound that, Tim, as well, that you really don't want to assume anything when you're writing your answer to the examiner? Like, you want to unpack your
yeah,
answer fully.
yeah, and sorry, I keep interrupting. Yeah, there'll be some tips I have in terms of how to do that. There's strategies that we certainly use at my school and are common amongst my peers and circles that I talk with at other schools, and how to do that and do it, I think, effectively. My experience is that students often, and it's the nature of the exam, the stresses involved, that they'll see the question and they'll just start writing. And they'll write everything they know on the topic, and they don't hit the pause button. One of my key tips is always to remember that, in essence, students have, it's 100-mark paper, 3 hours, so 1.8 minutes per mark. And so there's really good opportunity for students to hit pause before writing, actually analyze the question in a little more detail, to really think about the level of depth required and what component of the syllabus that they are actually assessing. There's a bit of a phrase, it's students can often give really good answers to the wrong question. And I certainly find that time and time again, where the students, and it's a bit sad for us, to be honest, because they've got that quite a deep knowledge of the syllabus. We know they do, but unfortunately we have to mark to the criteria that is in front of us to that question. And if they haven't addressed it properly, then yeah, they find themselves losing marks that we probably know they know the answers to. Yeah.
Which is unfortunate, right? Because it's a symptom, and it happens a lot with students. It happens to all of us when you're under pressure, when you're rushing, you're scanning the question. So what you're saying really is, I'm hearing, is a first thing students can be doing is like, take the time to read the question carefully, but then also just take that second to digest it and make sure you really understand the question that's being asked before you start to put pen to paper.
Yeah, absolutely. And just some examples that has jumped out at me at is often if there's a stimulus, and quite often that the bigger mark questions that might be 6, 7, 8 marks, they will require students to engage with data sets in the form of tables or graphs, sometimes two graphs. And then there'll be all this reading and examination of the graphs involved. And then the question itself might be 5 words with reference to the data, evaluate how X, Y, and Z. Students will then sort of just start writing, but they'll miss important language within the stem of the question itself, which is with reference to the data. And as soon as that appears, I absolutely guarantee that in the marking kit, students, those top mark levels will be required to engage with specific data points. So students, it's almost at times they're nervous to commit to engaging with data points that at time X, the concentration of this hormone was, for example, and they'll just talk about generalized trends where the data increased or it went up rather than backing it up with evidence from the data set, which was a requirement of the question. So that's something that's quite often makes an appearance in some of those responses where students, if you're in front of them, you could talk the answers out of them, but again, we have to mark what's in front of us. So just encourage students out there to not do themselves a disservice, get the marks that they have the ability to get, and really sort of focus in on analysing the question and thinking about what's going to be required for the marking criteria.
Yeah, and you touched on there the words that are in the question itself, like reference to the data. But you also touched on like the verb evaluate, like how important. I know those kind of key terms, those command terms are super important, like to understand. Like, what's your advice there when students are kind of scanning those questions and looking for those key words? Like, what are the things they should be really honing in on, watching out
Yeah.
for?
Look, it's a brilliant question. Look, a colleague many years back sort of did just a bit of an analysis on the biology paper, and they estimated around 60 to 70% of the questions were pitched at the explain level. Okay, and often the question will be quite explicit: explain the impact of mutations on variation within a species, and it's quite clear cut. But sometimes examiners can tweak what and explain, I guess, the language of it. Looks like, and it might read, for example, goodness me, I'm trying to think of an example, how do or to what extent does. And so if students have a really good knowledge of the glossary of terms or the NESA glossary of terms, I guarantee that the verb of the question or the cognitive load of that verb, be it to describe, explain, evaluate, they're sort of or identify that the bigger or more common ones that appear in the biology paper. The top marking brackets, if it was a 8 marker evaluate, I guarantee for 8, 7, sometimes even 6, the language of that marking kit will require a value judgment. And if you then were to jump over in hindsight and look at NESA's glossary of terms, it will say defining evaluate, for example, makes a value judgment. So explain, students, it's really essential. They know what it means to give an explanation. And the words I'll tell my own kids is to, if you see explain, use conjunction. So give a description of whatever the biology concept is in the question and use the conjunctions like this results in or this leads to, just to make sure they're thinking about the depth required for an explanation. Because if it's an explain question for 4 marks, again, I promise the top marking bracket of the marking criteria for a 4, if not a 3, will be cause and effect or provides an explanation of. And students can give really good descriptions, but if it was an explain question, again, they're really losing really easy marks that we know that they know, but again, can't give them because it doesn't address the, I guess, the cognitive load of that verb.
And I guess it goes back to your point before about why it's so important to do those practice exams, because
Yes.
that's the opportunity to get used to seeing those words, get used to what a structure of the answer would look like, so that when you are in the exam, you're potentially just reducing a little bit of that cognitive
Yeah.
load, right? Like you're
Yeah.
reducing a little bit of that hard work that your brain has to do if you're a bit more like, okay, I know the words, as you said, I'm going to use conjunctions for explain. Like your brain just starts firing.
Yeah.
It's going to give you a bit more momentum, I think, in the exam.
Yeah, and if that's sort of embedded in their thinking, and it's applicable across multiple subjects as well. There's any number of acronyms we can use. One of the important acronyms, or one of my favourite ones, is CUBE, and each letter stands for the following. So if you've got the question in front of you, hit pause, circle the verb, the C, just to get you thinking about that, with the requirements of the question, and is it a describe, is it an explain? because if you've engaged with that glossary of terms, which kids do and most teachers do across just to get you thinking about the level of detail required. Now, the U in the cube is underline, and what we're underlining is what's the core biology of this particular question? Is it again DNA replication? Is it protein synthesis? Is it mutation? So just again, we're now explaining. What are we explaining? We need to give some, if it was mutation, some characteristics and features of a mutation, and then if it was the explain, this leads to a change in the DNA sequence. And probably, well, they're all important. The B is really important as well. And it's just to box things like plurals. So S, I cannot stress how important examples is versus example. And so if the question requires examples, I'd be suggesting 2, if not 3, because if a student only addressed it with one example, again, I promise the marking criteria will really knock them from those top mark brackets down into the lower ones, simply because they've only used one example. And the other part of the boxing is plural, so the S and the word and. So with reference to meiosis and mutations, explain how, etc. That therefore requires students to explain the impact of a mutation, but then the features of meiosis and how that leads to variation within a species. And that's typically where a lot of questions will finish, the C, the U, the B. But the E's, often it might be elaborate or with examples. And it's just typically with the higher mark questions where with examples, and it's just to make sure they have some case studies that they can refer to. That's certainly my go-to, the main acronym. There's lots going around, as I said, but if students hit the pause button, cube the question, the stimulus, and that'll sort of hold them in good stead in terms of the depth they need to go into and what aspect of the course they need to go into depth with.
I love that. It's a really practical strategy,
Yeah,
something that students could be practicing now and
yeah,
kind of baking
absolutely.
into their revision so that it becomes automated in the moment, right? And I think what's really important to flag there and what you've just talked about is the fact that that's not content related. That's marks that even if you know the whole course, but you miss that plural on the example or you miss that key word, you're going to miss those marks. So what we're talking here is this is a way to earn
Yeah,
marks,
yeah,
right? Like this, and perhaps stand out from everyone else. So without
yeah,
even having to know more of the course per se.
yeah. No, it's a good point. And then I guess related to that, often in the 3, 4 and above mark questions, if you've missed that lesson or having a stressful moment in the exam, an important note is that with the marking criteria, nearly always for 1 mark is some relevant information. So if the anxiety has got the better of you in that moment, just write some core words related to the topic, not a repeat of the question or the stem of the question, but just to put some words that you just having some basic recall of, because accessing 1 mark for a 4 mark question is certainly better than a 0, and that can accumulate over the paper as well.
Yeah, and some of the other examiners and teachers I've been talking to have also said, like, give yourself a minute, come back to that question if
Yeah,
you need to, because sometimes just a bit of a pause while you move on to another couple of questions, it will come back to you and you're kind
yes.
of the back in your mind, an answer might come to you. So don't kind of like stress too much in that moment. Try to just kind of like manage it in a way.
Yeah, no, it's certainly good advice because, you're better off to move on. And as you say, hopefully the hard work's been done in the weeks leading up to it, and the knowledge is there.
It's there. It's in there
Yes,
somewhere.
yeah, exactly.
Let's shift gears slightly and just talk now about the content and about the syllabus. What are the areas that you would say, like, if students are just wanting to make sure they're kind of rock solid and going for a good, decent grade, like maybe not shooting for the stars, but just wanting to kind of like be rounded out, what are the areas or the topics that they should really be focusing on that tend to come up often in exams or tend to be like commonly assessed or basically just earn the marks?
Yeah. So is this where we're talking crystal ball, what we think will be in the exam, or?
Maybe a little bit. It could be a little bit crystal ball.
Yeah, yeah. Look. At the end of the day, biology is biology, right? So it doesn't matter how many times the syllabus or the course changes. Some concepts are always going to be front and center, and they will assess them in some shape or form. Now, obviously, that might be a 1 mark question, and you might feel hard done by if you've really focused in on protein synthesis and knowing all things related to transcription and translation. But that's one of the topics as an example. It will absolutely be assessed in some capacity. And so, that, along with the idea of mutations and the impact that they have on variation, that is always guaranteed to make an appearance. The other big ones would be, again, I've mentioned it several times today, DNA replication, complementary base pairings, the impact of mutations on those. Reproduction, it's a new content area in more detail, at least in the current syllabus. That's certainly made an appearance in most of the exams, I'll say, since the introduction of the new syllabus, and that can take different forms. It could be a multiple choice, again, where students need to know how bacteria reproduce, binary fission, or they might be required to construct a table comparing the outcomes of sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. So again, it's those big core biological concepts always will be assessed. Mitosis and or meiosis is another one, and the concept of crossing over and how that leads to the variation. And one really important focus area for students, and I'm probably guilty of myself, we focus on the knowledge component of the course in our day-to-day teaching, but the skills component, skills-based assessments, it's mandatory that they're 60% on the working scientifically skills. And they will absolutely be assessed. And that includes the graphing questions where students might have to plot the data, or equally they might be required to analyse data within a particular graph that's given to them. So students I'd really encourage them to be mindful of those core scientific skills, because they will be assessed, guaranteed. And in terms of the questions that you sort of, if I had to guess, it's more the areas of the current syllabus. I still call it the new syllabus, even though we've had it for many years now, but are relatively new to the current syllabus. And that's things like hormones that are involved in pregnancy and birth. That wasn't in the previous syllabus, and I guess to ensure that we're teaching it and that students are learning it, those sort of questions will often come up. So I'd encourage students to ask their teachers which of the syllabus dot points are new to the current syllabus, and that they definitely make an appearance each year. One that's got a heavy focus in the current syllabus is biotechnologies and genetic technologies, just with the wave of them that are coming through in those real life applications. I'm gonna make my best guess and say that there'll be a higher mark question where students need to refer to a genetic technology, and I guess the ethical implications of it, the advantages and the limitations of these genetic technologies, and certainly encourage students to know the difference between a biotechnology and a genetic technology. That's another area that we mentioned earlier, where students can start writing and put a lot of information out there. And I use that expression, good answer, wrong question. Students will often, in my experience, talk about things like cloning or artificial insemination or pollination as genetic technologies, and they're actually not. They're biotechnologies. And so biotechs being anything that humans as a species manipulates for our benefit, whereas genetic technologies, where there's an actual change or manipulation of the genetic information, and that's typically done through recombinant DNA technology. And the new one that everyone's talking about is CRISPR-Cas9, where we knock in genes or knock out genes and actually change the genome of the chosen organism. So yeah, things like that. I haven't seen a big mark question on genetic technologies that I can think of, certainly.
You
Watch
heard it
this
here.
space.
You heard it here first.
Yeah, exactly.
We've got on recording now. Only time will tell, right? Now,
Yeah.
thinking about the other end of the spectrum, if a student came to you and said, "Oh, Mr. Sloane, I want to be like top biology student. I'm really going for band 6." What advice do you tend to have for those students? Like, you've covered off like the essentials in a sense, and cast the crystal ball of what you think might appear. What about those students that are really trying to earn top spot? Like, what should they be
Yeah.
doing?
Yeah, good question as well. They're all good questions. Look, a lot of we focus on the syllabus in schools for obvious reasons. There's some other really important documents, those being the glossary of terms and students embedding down what each of those verbs mean. And another important document, probably second to the syllabus, is the performance band descriptors. And I don't know, I engage with them a lot, just various circles I like to hang out with and talk about all things nerdy biology. But in short, in my experience, students quite often aren't overly familiar with the performance band descriptors. So when we talk about a band 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, for every course that students study, NESA has a performance band descriptor. And it tells us what a band 6 student should be able to do in biology. A band 5 student can do the following. And it gives you that sort of broad understanding of the requirements of each of the band the band levels. And so for a band 6 student, I'll talk band 5 and 6 for the moment. Some language that is unique to them are words like students are required to clearly articulate the difference between trends, patterns, and relationships. And the other combo of three is validity, reliability, and accuracy. Now, if you asked any student on a given day, most of them are not able to distinguish between those three word groupings. They'll define reliability using the word validity, and to improve accuracy, we repeat the experiment, and it instantly tells the examiner that they don't know the difference between them. So there will be questions in the exam, all the sciences, because it's a common skill. Make sure that students know the difference between those terms, because it's common to band 5 and 6. Now, that might be designing an epidemiology study where students need to talk about really large study groups where they compare a control group with the experimental group. That's validity. Repeating it over a study group of 10,000 patients, about it, try and ensure the results are reliable. Just ensuring that they can clearly define each of those terms and know the difference between them and how to apply them. And the other two big words that jump out at me for the band 6 descriptor, making it unique from 5, is that a band 6 student can write in a concise manner. So often you'll find with the eight mark questions that some students will write it in the space provided, which is typically around an A4 page. And let's say that they can get a beautifully structured, really concise, to the point, and they get a really easy 8 out of 8, where another student, they're at that threshold of a 5, 6. They'll write the similar response, but it'll be written over 3 pages. And we're having to flick back and forward and just looking for the words and trying to join the dot for the students. That concept of a concise writing is unique to a band 6 student. And the other really important one that sets a band 6 student apart is being able to apply knowledge to unfamiliar contexts. And I think we'll talk a little bit later on about some of my favourite questions, or my favourite and probably the students' least favourite for the same reason, was where students are required to apply knowledge across the different modules. Biology, there's year 12, there's 4 modules, module 5, 6, 7, 8. And you'll more often than not find that the bigger mark questions require the linking of concepts between hereditary module 5, impact of mutations, genetic 6 module, change module 6, and then non-infectious diseases in module 8. And that idea of applying knowledge to unfamiliar contexts, often, I can teach about a case study on a particular protein, and in the exam itself, there'll be some totally unfamiliar protein the students never heard of, and they might panic a little bit at first. But again, hit the pause button and understand what that question's asking. It's more likely to be about protein synthesis than it is about the protein itself. So apply your knowledge to that unfamiliar context. I'm confident you will have learnt it in class, maybe just different examples, but the knowledge itself is the same.
Well, they can't assess them on things that aren't within the syllabus, right? So I
Yeah,
guess they've got to kind of put that lens and be like, okay, well, don't panic.
yeah,
I know this somehow.
yeah,
You've just got to find the connection to what it's related to.
yeah. Yeah, that's right. And they're the sort of questions that will also actually, across the knowledge units, there'll also be the skill requirements where, they might give different allele frequencies of a protein the kids aren't familiar with. It'll be in a table or a graph, and they need to start analysing, processing skills 4 and 5, the data and information contained within them.
It's a lot to do in the moment, right? Like
Yes, it
we
definitely is.
definitely empathize with the students for
Yeah.
that. And you segued perfectly to the next question I was going to ask, which is about those particularly tricky questions, or as you said, some of your favorite ones that have come up over time. What are some of the really interesting doozy kind of questions?
Yeah. So look, I'll talk to 2 and encourage students to go look them up. Hopefully I've got the references right. It was 2019, one of the later questions, question 33. At first glance, it shocked me as a teacher as well. It was worth 20 marks, which is absolutely unheard of in a biology paper. But then the good news was, once you hit the relax button, it was actually spread over multiple components. And just to highlight that idea about, again, band 6 students applying knowledge to unfamiliar contexts. Part A of that question, they make reference to, it's related to Alzheimer's disease, the overarching question. And they're looking at a particular protein and its development or lack thereof, and how it's linked to Alzheimer's disease. And again, not many students would have studied that in depth in their actual courses, but then it referenced three particular, or it's amyloid beta protein. The question A then asks, outline the main steps that the brain cells use to make proteins such as amyloid beta. And again, many students from memory left that blank because they'd never heard of amyloid beta. And so I didn't get taught about that in class. But in actual fact, the students literally just needed to give some brief details about transcription, translation of the gene related to this protein. So it was about protein synthesis. And so it wasn't a trick question, but again, about hitting the relax button and just thinking about what that question's really asking. It was bread and butter protein synthesis, what should have been an easy 3 marks for the students. And then across the rest of that question, I won't go into all 20 marks of it, but students were required to assess whether it could be deemed an infectious or a non-infectious disease because they're inheriting it from a parent, which is infectious diseases module 7 and non-infectious because it's to deal with the protein buildup in the brain. And they, I guess, were required to have that understanding of module 7 and 8 and then come to an opinion based on the information contained within the stimulus of the question. And again, sometimes students are afraid to commit to giving a judgment because they feel they might be wrong. But I think the point of this particular question was to get students to look at the evidence in front of them and make a value judgment, which in most cases in this question would be on the fence where there's enough evidence where you can make an argument for it being an infectious or a non-infectious disease in actual fact. So that was one. And then the other one was more recently in 2022 question 29. It was a 7 marker. Strongly recommend students have a look at that one. And because from memory, it had 2 graphs and a table contained within it, certainly 2 graphs. There were some easy access marks, part A, which were students need to explain why cotton yields had changed over the course of time, and it was due to a transgenic gene being inserted or transgene being inserted into the crop, and that was relatively straightforward to access. The 5-mark component of it really required students to engage with both graphs and extract the information that was contained and relate them to one another. So that's what I was mentioning earlier about the skills component of the course. Everything the student needed was in the images in front of them, but they were typically done really poorly because students would talk about the top graph and just totally ignore the bottom graph, which was central to the question. And again, it's unfortunate, but I guarantee most students, you could talk 4 or 5 out of 5 if you just got them to hit the pause and think about what this question's asking. So again, great question because it was across multiple modules, highlighting the point that rote learning is not the solution to getting the big marks. It's about engaging with the stimulus and thinking, what depth do I need to go into for this question? And, calling upon, different modules.
And yeah, as you said, being able to make those connections across is really key, isn't it?
It is, definitely.
And can be hard when you're staring at 20 marks right in front of you, thinking, oh gosh, this is, and straight away the first one is not something you're familiar with, but it's right there in front of you.
Yeah.
It brings me, I guess, towards my last question around like the exam moment itself, students writing, students sitting there. What's your advice just as they do the exam, if they hit a blank wall in terms of recalling information, using writing in the margins, handwriting, any kind of like tips that you tend to share with students as they're, really setting their mind on the actual sitting of the exam?
Yeah, getting down to doing the exam. I guess tip 1 is just hopefully you've done the hard work. Obviously, you have to study. You've got to do the hard work leading up to the exam. And back to what we discussed earlier, try and get a good night's rest. Easier said than done. Have a good breakfast so you're going in with a full stomach. I think personally, avoiding those big group discussions, leading into as they all gather outside the exam, because again, some of those conversations can just lead to doubting, some self-doubts as to whether you know certain parts of the course. If you've done the hard work, done the study, practice your previous exam papers, when you sit down, you've got that 5-minute reading time, confident that the knowledge will come flowing back to you. And if some of the questions you don't know at first glance, just move on. You've got that 1.8 minutes per mark, and in actual fact, it's probably more than that. Once you get some of the earlier multiple choice, you'll get through in just a handful of seconds, hopefully. So just be mindful of the time that you can spend planning. And Yeah, in terms of sitting when you're in front of the exam itself, if the current sort of system, if you can write in the margins, try and write concisely. Typically, the space provided is deemed what is necessary to answer the question in full. But certainly, if it's on the paper, it will be marked. Um, if it's been crossed out, it won't be marked, is the current sort of, I guess, thinking, because the idea is that the students want us to ignore it. So it will be ignored if you've crossed it out. If it asks for one example, a particular question, just give one example. Look, I often mark exams at schools where we'll say give one or two examples, and sure enough, students will extend the table and give us a third and a fourth. If you do that and one of them's wrong, you've then just contradicted yourself, so you then run the risk of losing marks. So if that stem of the question, just analyze CUBIT, CUB in particular. And if it asks for two examples, only give two and choose the best two, the two that you think is best. And avoid giving that unnecessary information, because it can lead to, I guess, too much information being provided that starts to turn to waffle, and remembering Band 6 students write nice and concisely. So yeah, just focus on structure, response, and answering it to the best of your knowledge.
Nice. And your final message for students as they bunker down and study and then they face the biology exam in October?
Yeah, certainly good luck to all of them. Again, you've done the hard work, but I always think it's important to hit the pause button. It's important. It's an important milestone in life, the HSC, not just the biology exam. It's still, I tell my own students, it still rates as one of the more stressful of my life to date, even though I'm just clocked over 50. And a lot of that's self-induced, because the pressures that you place on yourself and how you'll go compared to siblings or to your peers. Whilst it's an important milestone, it's not the be all and end all. I promise you, it's not. Give it the best attempt that you can and be proud of the efforts, and don't be too harsh on yourself, to be honest, because you're all amazing, to all the students out there, and life just does find its way after the HSC. So study hard, give it your best shot, and be proud of that. And life goes on, I promise.
Great. It's been so great talking to you today, Tim. Thank you.
No problems at all. Pleasure being here, and good luck, everyone.